We were talking about what are healthy habits and how do you drive success, all the things that you experience as like a high functioning executive and being a mom and a wife. Over the last 10 years of me being in therapy, I've kind of mentally mapped this pyramid. The bottom of your pyramid has to be very, very stable, right?
Welcome to the Stacking Habits Podcast with your hosts, David, Matthew, and Caleb. Our mission each week is to dig into the habits, rituals, and routines of guests who are living life to the fullest. But remember, knowledge without action is worthless. So be sure to take what you hear and put it into practice. Turn these words into works in your own life. Without further ado, let's dive in.
All right, welcome back to the Stacking Habits Podcast. Today we're joined by Bonnie Watson. Bonnie is currently the CEO of Energize Colorado, which helps lending for small businesses. But before she did that, she got into the co-working space with Altspaces. And I'm curious to know a little bit more about how you got into the co-working space. I remember back probably around 2019, 2020, I was very interested in that model. I looked into it a lot and it couldn't seem to make sense to me from a financial standpoint of how much investment would there be with how much interest there would be in the model. And it seemed like there was a lot of issues with current models going around with co-working spaces. So what caused you to get into that? How were you able to be successful in an extremely competitive space that billion-dollar businesses ended up having a lot of issues with, as I'm sure you're well aware of? How did you guys kind of manage that?
Yeah, so a little bit of context into it. So my husband is a co-working expert. He was a co-founder in a software company called Proximity, which helps power co-working spaces globally. And so we lived in Telluride right before the pandemic, moved up there in 2019, worked out of their co-working space on Main Street. And obviously through the evolution of the pandemic, they lost the space and we were working out of our kitchen, counter essentially. And that wasn't sustainable for us. And so we started to kind of look around and, really it was like a necessity for a solution personally is what kind of sparked this. And we found a space in Telluride and opened that space. And one of the big problems with the co-working model is that it's not financially sustainable and oftentimes has to be subsidized by, government money or working with nonprofits or, partnering with a library. And partly that is the overhead, right? You have space managers in the space and a lot of co-working spaces fail. And you add the fact that we were in rural Colorado, which you take all the barriers to entry that small business face in rural Colorado and just add it to that already complicated model. And so we said, we want to solve a problem. We opened the space, Brian and I were there, but we knew that rural co-working is really important for connectivity of entrepreneurs and now remote workers post-pandemic, right? We had a huge influx of remote workers. And we said, we can't sustain it how it typically was in the traditional model. So what if we tried automation? Because people post-pandemic and in the pandemic became very comfortable with automation, whether you were ordering food or whatever you were doing, people became comfortable with the idea. And so we tried it and people really liked it, and they could just quickly check in online. We'd send an onboarding email that would give them all, space access. And they had, the door opened essentially to the co-working space in these communities across rural Colorado. And so we ended up acquiring spaces from Proximity, who, had spaces in Ridgeway and Montrose and Grand Junction. We added them to the network and added a few more and tied them together, and we had an automated model that space members could essentially travel through from Grand Junction to Telluride. And that was also a huge value add for people. But really, it came out of solving our problem, but also when you look at the rural ecosystem of Colorado, we wanted to support the rural ecosystem of Colorado, and co-working is really, really pivotal to that model because there aren't a lot of resources in rural Colorado.
Did you see a lot of the main co-working space at the same time try and go towards automation as well, or is that not really something their model was compatible with at the time? I'm curious. If I was them, that seems to be my first thought too, would be, hey, let's take away a lot of these overhead expenses. Did they do that, or did they kind of stick with their original model and see if that worked for them?
My observation is, especially in urban areas, they kept that model, that traditional model with a space manager, because they have, the human capital, they have the capital to support that. But in rural, that was a big missing piece, finding a skill set to, have an automated model or be a space manager was something that we just didn't really have. And so I think I hate pulling out the urban rural card, but there was a definite difference in how people approached it. And we got a lot of interest in it. My husband was on all sorts of co-working podcasts and people were like, how are you doing that? And it was from all walks of co-working, right? And
Mhm.
realizing the value of an automated system.
Do you guys still work out of a co-working space, or do you work out of home now?
So my husband works out of a co-working space called Peak Co-working in Evergreen, and I work out of my home office in Evergreen.
Gotcha. That's really cool. I love the co-working model as a whole, because I've been an entrepreneur, self-employed for, I think, going on a little over 10, no, not 10 years. I forget how long now, 8 years, something like that. It's been a little while, but I've been working from home, and I've always seen that there's, at least in my opinion, other people have different experiences. In my opinion, I tend to be a little more productive when I somehow get out of the house to work, whether it be go to the office or even just be not even necessarily around a community, just going somewhere outside of the house where my mind goes, hey, I'm not at home anymore. This is work time. Now I'm back home. This is home time. And the lines definitely get blurred when you're at home, especially when there's kids coming in and all the normal distractions and stuff like that. And so I love co-working for that reason. I live out in not even rural Phoenix, but it's Southeast Valley of Phoenix. And even though it's an extremely populated area, there's very few co-working spaces that I can get to without having to drive back into town like 45 minutes. And so even though I'm not in a rural area, I guess it's been deemed by enough co-working spaces to not have enough demand to have something out here. And so I love the model you were talking about of having something fully automated, because it would be awesome to have something out here where people, I know all the people who work from home around me, could go to without having to drive into Phoenix or one of the main areas. And I'm sure the reason they're doing that is because they don't have your model adopted where they can manage that overhead by doing things remote. And so that's really cool. You guys were able to build that. How did that work from a standpoint of working together with your husband, working with a spouse? I know working and managing a business by itself can be a little overwhelming, and then adding a spouse on top of that and that whole relationship dynamic. What were your guys' kind of keys to building that business successfully together?
Yeah, it's a great question. Going into business with your spouse is a frankly pretty ballsy move. And it really tests your relationship. And I think, you talk to a lot of couples who are entrepreneurs, like you either come out of that experience and sell your business and you say, we're going to do that again, or like, we are never touching that again. Right. Like, and,
Yeah.
we've seen couples get divorced because of that. And fortunately for us, like when we went into it, we have a really good relationship, fortunately, but we set some really strict boundaries around what that looked like, right? Because not
Yeah.
only were we living together in the same house during the pandemic and Telluride, like we had no other interaction with people. And then we started a business together. You're just constantly with your spouse. And which is not a bad thing, but we set some boundaries, and we basically said, like, if this is like I always think about a volleyball court, right? Like we're going to draw a distinct line in the sand, and this is our personal life. And when we step over that line, this is our professional life. And those two things do not blend, right? We don't bring work home, and we don't take home to work, essentially, right? And you kind of have to like check yourself, whichever way you're, walking through that door, you have to check yourself, and you have to be, respectful of the space for your partner and for yourself and your mental health, frankly. And we implemented that rule day one. And that was a rule that we were very steadfast about. And it saved us a lot of arguments. It saved us a lot of heartache. And we were successful. And I think we came out of this experience saying, like, I would absolutely start another business with you.
Yeah.
That's a no brainer. Right. But like, put my husband always tells me I put them in boxes, right? Like I'm good at compartmentalizing things. And that was really important for the success of the business
Yeah.
and for our marriage.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure also probably just thinking about the business relationships and business partners I've had in the past, the ones that seem to work out the best are the ones where we almost have very different skill sets from one another, that so much so that it doesn't necessarily overlap all the time. Do you feel like you and your husband have very different skill sets from each other? Or do you think you guys think a lot alike?
It's funny. We were just having this conversation, kind of reflecting on the 4 years that we had these businesses. And, like as a chief executive officer in finance and in this industry, like that's my lane, that's my expertise. That's where
Yeah.
I have the ability to be a visionary and an innovator. Right. But in co-working, that was not my lane. Like I didn't really know anything about the industry. He was deeply passionate about it. And I think the very best relationships have the entrepreneur and the operator, right? So, and I would tell him, I said, like, this industry, you have a vision for it. Go be the entrepreneur, go tell the story, be that guy that, people associate with alt space. And when you give me what the plan is, I can execute as the operator, right? Like I can come in here and say, this is XYZ, how we're going to get this done, essentially. And that was a really helpful like bifurcation of our skill sets.
Yeah.
And it worked really beautifully, right? But I didn't know anything about co-working, and I just trusted, my husband being the expert to say like, this is what we're doing. And I'm like, okay, I'm on board. Like, let's do that.
That's really, really cool. No, I like how you guys manage that and separate it. I'm sure it's easy in concept to say separate home life and business life. Like you said, when you're working out of the same house, living in the same house, all of that, I'm sure it can be difficult at times, even with that intention to separate kind of that work and personal life.
Right.
Do you guys, I'm curious, living in Telluride, random question. Do you guys snowboard, ski? Have you guys ever been into that or not really?
Yeah, we
ski.
Yep.
That's awesome. I love Telluride. I love that area because I grew up snowboarding. My wife snowboards. It's something fun we can do together. So I can just imagine if we lived somewhere like that, I'd be like, hey, let's go take some time on the slopes, get out of the business mindset for a little while. It would be a fun way to unwind. So you come from more of a finance background. Would you say you're very entrepreneurial?
I am today.
You are today.
And so it's really interesting. So I came from banking, and then I had a stint in venture capital and acceleration with high growth startups. And I ended up coming back to small business and supporting small business. And, part of that journey was that I became an entrepreneur. And, I kind of felt like, not a farce is the word I'm going to use, but like I was coaching these startups and coaching these small businesses and financing them and, investing in them. But like, I had never actually like walked the walk, if you will, and I was, giving advice about this because it was my skill set, but like I had actually never done it. And it's funny, my husband and I met in college in a class called entrepreneurial finance. And in that class, I remember the professor asking me, would you ever be an entrepreneur? And I was like, hell no, like it's such a hard job. It's not my skill set. And I ended up becoming an entrepreneur. I was the one that actually proposed Altspace to my husband, and him being an innovator and entrepreneur was like, yeah, let's do this, And it was such an important experience for me in my professional journey in helping other, startups and small businesses, because I was able to sit at the table and say, like, I've been where you've been. I know how to solve that problem. Let's solve that for you. Right. And so I came from one side of the field and I was on the other side now, and I was able to see both viewpoints, and I had walked in both shoes. And so today I would very much identify as an entrepreneur, but until 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have. And it was such a critical journey for me to, essentially do it, to be in it and to learn the lessons of doing, like you can only learn so much in a textbook, right? But like, there's a lot to be said for like street smarts, if you will. And so today, absolutely, I would absolutely identify that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you bring that up. The street smarts entrepreneurship. It's odd. I liked my college experience. I loved the classes I took. I feel like I did get a lot of value from them, but I wouldn't say that any one particular class gave me like, oh, if I didn't have this skill set, I couldn't have been an entrepreneur. Like so much of it is in the moment learning. It's not something you even go into the business knowing. It's something you figure out along the way. And so it's interesting trying to teach entrepreneurship, because in one sense you can teach basics, but in another sense it's something that you kind of have to have the grit inside of you to figure out along the way. And so it's cool that you're able to do that. Now, like you said, now you're a better position to help other people do that, which it sounds like is probably a lot of your job with Energize Colorado, correct?
Yeah, one thing I deeply miss, I was with the Telluride Venture Fund, and we would run accelerators, with different themes, whether it was mining and reclamation or whether it was investment boot camps or whatever. And I had a lot more hands-on experience at that time and was really helping coach businesses through whatever they were going through, and whether we were taking them to demo day for investment or whatever. But now at Energize Colorado, I don't get that time as much with entrepreneurs, and it's more about the challenge of trying to innovate the capital system in Colorado for small businesses. And so I miss that. I don't get the touch point as much with entrepreneurs as I used to. But that experience, I'm elevating that into a CEO role to really, I have the viewpoint and understand like what the challenges are. And I wouldn't have been able to do that had I not had that experience.
That makes sense. I want to get into in just a second the 3 Ps of success. But before that, just one thing I'm curious about when talking about lending to small businesses, and like you're saying, fixing kind of the lending issues in Colorado for small businesses. Lending by itself is a very difficult thing to do, to lend and be able to do that. It's a very risky proposition in and of itself. Then adding small businesses on top of that increases the risk like tenfold. Even just with my experience being an entrepreneur, starting a business, we started a business, we're able to sell it, successfully exit that business. I'm not even fully confident in myself when I start a new business that, hey, I'm sure this new idea is going to work. And so coming at it from the standpoint of a lending institution, how in the world do you kind of figure out what businesses to take risks on and which businesses not to? Because even like I said, coming to from my experience, it would be tough for me to identify, hey, this exact business model is great. Or do you guys come to it more from the standpoint of looking at the CEO or the leader of that organization and saying we're more so putting our dollars behind this person as an individual versus just the idea they have at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think traditionally this industry has, and entrepreneurs have looked at traditional banks for access to capital, right? It's the first place you would naturally think to go. And oftentimes it's not like 9 out of 10 times, it's like 10 out of 10 times they get told no, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this like really negative connotation in the industry that like banks don't have my back and, all the things that are said. And the truth is that like banking is where small businesses want to be eventually, right? But all of the work that funds like ours and CDFIs are doing is helping be the stepping stone, to essentially bankability and accessing capital. And I think one of the things that we're trying to change is that looking less at entrepreneurs and small businesses from like the bankable lens, saying like, do you have the credit? Do you have the collateral? And saying, do you have the character instead? Like when I look at a small business and an entrepreneur, I say like, do I trust you? Are you believable? Let's vet your business plan. What holes and weaknesses do you have and what strengths do you have in that? Are you being realistic about your projections? Like what traction do you have? And so we're looking kind of more at those character-based things and less at those like bankable, 5 C's of credit, because businesses don't have that. And especially, as we move into this very digital age, we're not brick and mortar businesses as much anymore. We're very much moving away from that. And so we have to take a different approach to lending. And our organization, and especially some of these earlier funds like ours, we do have a riskier portfolio. That's very, very true of this work. But we also realize that we have to marry that with really robust technical assistance. And the way that we approach that is like a peer-to-peer model through acceleration, right? So we fund a company and then we put them through this peer-to-peer model where they're sitting in the room with other entrepreneurs who have essentially solved the problems that they may be experiencing, right? And that's really powerful because that keeps them away from that like cliff of death, right? Which is very common. I think the statistic is like 7 years is like really your hurdle that you have to succeed to be successful in business, right? And so that's kind of how we look at it is like, who are you as an entrepreneur? What traction do you have? Are you believable? Are you really solving a problem? Like what's your value prop in the market?
Is going through that kind of co-op with those other businesses, is that mandatory if they accept funding from Energize Colorado that they're part of that community, or is that just an option for them?
It's an option for them, but a lot of entrepreneurs immediately see the value in it, right? And they opt in for that accelerator, but not all entrepreneurs need it either.
Have you been, I'm guessing, a part of those sessions at times? Were you regularly a part of those sessions to kind of see how, I'm curious how those are run. Is it one person kind of running and teaching a specific topic, or is it a bunch of question and answers and people answer? How do you kind of organize those meetings?
Kind of all of the above. It just depends on the need of the entrepreneur, but it's really focused on that, peer-to-peer model.
Okay. That makes sense. That's really, really cool. I think that, like you said, going to a business bank for a business loan is something that, like you said, almost 10 out of 10 times is no. I know very few people that have ever gone through that process and come out the other end with cash from the bank.
Right.
Most of the time, it's something kind of laugh at when someone says they're got a new idea, they're going to get a loan from the bank. It just doesn't typically happen that way. And so I really like that there's organizations like yours that exist. And I really like your model because I think that's, you can have the best business idea in the world. I'm sure you've seen this, but if you don't have the right person running that, it's never going to go anywhere. And you can also, I'm sure you've seen very mediocre ideas, but with the right person somehow can make that flourish and do something amazing. So I really like that attention to character over the typical credit signals you were talking about that you typically get.
Yeah.
Walk me through your 3 Ps of success and how that kind of came about and how that aligns with what you're doing now and the success with the co-working space you guys did before.
Yeah. So when I was talking to David, we were talking about like, what are healthy habits and how do you drive success with, all the things that you experience as like a high functioning executive and being a mom and a wife. And I've gone through, I'm a big advocate for counseling and therapy for people. I think that that's really, really valuable. And I think, over the last 10 years of me being in therapy, I've kind of mentally mapped this pyramid, if you will. And I think about like, the bottom of your pyramid has to be very, very stable, right? And that starts with you, right? Like I have to be centered and I have to be confident and I have to be in a good place to be a good mother, to be a good wife, to be a good executive, to be a good friend, right? And so like the bottom of that pyramid has to be stable and that starts with you. And so like that first P is personal, right? It's about me, it's about what I do to really be the best version of myself, right? Because that influences everything else that you do. It influences your influence of people around you. It influences your organization. And then the top of that is your people, right? So the next layer of that pyramid is the people that you surround yourself with. And that's really kind of the them. Like, how are you impacting people? And on top of that is, your professional goal, whether it's your business or your day job, whatever it may be, that's the us. So you're taking the work that you're doing and the habits you're building with yourself and then with your people, and you bring that together at the top. And that's really where you see the success in organizations and you can drive goals. But over the years, it's all about people, right? And that's the root of everything. Like I think we sometimes lose sight of that as business owners or executives, and we say like the problem is this. The problem is not that. The problem and solution is the people, right? Like it's the people around you that cause the problem and that are going to solve the problem, right? And so when I sat down and talked with David, I thought like this is all about people and it's also really about mental health. And when I look at these habits in those three areas, it's about protecting, my mental health, your mental health, and making sure that you're heard. And ultimately, if you do that right, you can really drive change in an organization or within your business.
I like that a lot. When you were talking, it reminded me, I have a professor named Kevin Miller in college. He used to always have this saying that once you start a business and you establish profitable demand, every problem you have in the business from that point forward is a people problem because you're working with people in some way, shape, and form. Like you said, people think they have problems with other things, but no, everything is a people problem in some way, shape, and form.
Yeah,
and so absolutely. I really like that. What habits have you found to be most helpful for you? I'm specifically talking about time management right now. As far as being a wife and a mother, those are extremely time consuming, all encompassing tasks. And then managing a business, being a CEO of a business on top of that really, just takes that to the next level. What habits have you found to be most successful for you in your life that you're kind of see you thriving with and you notice real fast when you don't have those in place?
I think if I come down to like my personal self, like I always tell people sleep, like 6 hours is not going to get you anywhere. Like you need to be having like between like 8 and 9 or 10 hours of sleep. And especially as a woman, like hormonally, like we have to have more sleep to be successful. Men can you don't have to have so much sleep, frankly, but we do. And so sleep is like your best friend. And I think I look at, especially the millennial culture and Gen Z, there is this mentality that like, it's really sexy to work hard, play hard. And my husband and I used to very much embody that mentality. And it's not, because what it does is you burn out, right? And there's nothing notable or attractive about burning yourself out and working long hours. And the more rested you are, the more successful you are, right? And so like prioritizing that in your life is really, really critical. And when you do that, you have better, frankly, time management, right? You can make time for things. And that's kind of part of the time management too, is like carving that out for yourself. I think the other thing when I like look at specifically time management is being really diligent about how you're spending your time, right? And I think the other thing that at least I've noticed about myself is we spend a lot of time like looking at our phones and being in engaged in things that we shouldn't, and we're missing everything around us, right? Like we're missing our children growing up and we're missing connection with our partner and our friends and our parents, and it's like just put that down. And once you like remove this and all the distractions of it, you continue to have more time to, I would say, like invest better into things, right? And I think giving grace to that too. Like there's no, I can say you can get 10 hours of sleep every night, but like there's nights when I go to bed at 12 o'clock, right? Because there's things going on and there's fires going on with your child or with your business or with your, company. Like, it's not perfect. Nobody practices it perfectly, but those are just things that I think like you wouldn't directly conflate with time management, but they're really, really critical in being successful in that.
Absolutely. Just curious, what age do you have one child or a few children or?
One. She's almost 2.
Almost 2. Okay. Yeah. It's funny. Sleep is definitely very important, but I also can tell certain times when entrepreneurs talk about their sleep routines, whether they have kids or not, with how how they approach their sleep. Because a lot of times, sure, it's easy to say 10 hours. I'd love to get 10 hours, but as you know, with the child, it doesn't always work out that way. But when you took over as CEO, this was an existing organization before, correct? Was that difficult for you to go from leading a business in an entrepreneurial role to then somewhat being an employee in a sense of another business and not having as much direct control as you probably did before? Or does it still feel like you're able to scratch that entrepreneurial itch in your current CEO role that you were able to at the previous business as well?
Um, I think that I've been able to find a really good balance. I think that I thrive better with more structure. And I think that's very much embodied in my work and my personal life. And so coming into an organization that, while new since 2020, does have a lot of structure, right? And I think I'm able to really kind of bring that entrepreneurial mindset in and say, like, we're still very much a startup, even as a nonprofit. Like, we really embody that mentality in the organization that, like, we're here to innovate. We have to move quickly. We have to take risks, calculated risk. But that's kind of scratched that entrepreneurial itch for me, if you will. Like, let's innovate. Let's find a real solution that can help people that's different than what the industry is doing today. I don't thrive as well. Like, my husband, for example, if you would talk to him, like, he loves the chaos of entrepreneurism and, like, the unknown. And, like, that is just not my ballgame. Like,
Yeah,
I want risk is okay,
a
but,
little
like,
more orderly.
let's figure out, yeah, what the next steps are. And so I think it's transitioned really well. And I've been able to, like, you know, not perfectly, but in a really sense, like, balance them pretty well. But I personally like that structured piece a bit more.
I really like how you're describing your guys' different personalities and relationships, because I see that working very well together as a partnership. There's kind of, you always have, it seems like, those two extremes in a business: the visionary, the one that's off the wall, always over here, and the other one that's saying, hey, let's come back to earth and organize this and make sure we can actually get it done. And you need that tension in a business. One thing me and my business partners, Caleb and David, the other hosts of this podcast, always talk about is, I think one of the things that was able to work well for us in our business is that we have very different personalities and very different skill sets. And oftentimes it does create tension, which is true. But I think for a successful business, you need that tension to kind of weed out bad ideas and not all go straight in the wrong direction at full speed. I've seen a lot of people. I have a class that I'm able to help out with each semester at the college I graduated from. And it's talking to business students before they graduate. And one of the things I always tell them is, when you're looking at business partners, don't find someone that thinks just like you, that has the same ideas as you. It's easy to do that because you think, hey, we have the same idea, we're very like each other, it'll work out great. But oftentimes you find that you run the same way in the wrong direction, and you don't realize it until it's too late. Find someone with very different skill sets than you, a different kind of personality that can create some tension. And normally those are the relationships I see that go the furthest in business. And so it's really cool to see you kind of talk about you and your spouse that way, and how it seems like you guys have that perfect partnership. So yeah, I think you guys should start another business together. It sounds like it would be a recipe for success.
Anytime soon. I need a little break.
You need a little break from it first, and then you
Please.
can add in the child there eventually as
Yeah.
well, and start training them up.
Yeah, see how there's never a good time for anything, right? Like,
A family business, I've thought about that before with my young kids, like thinking about having a family business in the future. That would definitely be an entirely different dynamic, trying to work with your kids. And there definitely be some good things about it. I have a friend actually in Colorado. He runs a business called General Air. I'm not sure if you've ever driven around and seen General Air locations. They have about 12 of them in Colorado, but he has a large business, and it's very much a family run business. And his sons are getting old enough, they're graduating now, and they're starting to work in the business. And he's experiencing that whole dynamic. He took it over from his dad. And I love that. But it also, I can see, just talking to him, the pros and cons of having that environment. But I don't. I've never worked with family like you worked with your husband, and so it's interesting to me just always hear those stories, trying to think of how that would potentially work in the future.
yeah,
But I like it.
it's funny that you say that, because now, while we've never, like, our kids are obviously not old enough to be that engaged, but my grandparents owned the bookstore for the School of Mines in Golden for
Oh,
a couple
nice.
decades, I think. And they, their kids were old enough in their, like, early 20s to, like, work in the business with them, and they, hired them as employees. And I'm sure that they had their challenges, and we've certainly heard about them, but it also created, like, such a tight knit unit in our family.
Yeah.
Like, they were like a family community, right? And the stories and relationships that you see today were fostered because of that, right? And they opened the door to their children to come in, and their children then ended up starting businesses because of that, right? So I think there's a lot to be said for that, but like you're also putting a lot on the line, right? With, personal relationships too. And I can only imagine how
Yeah.
difficult that could have been sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can definitely see the pros and cons to that. I was listening to an interview a little while ago with the CEO of Netflix, and he had something interesting to say. I don't think this can be applied to everything, but it was interesting. Someone asked him what the keys are to success in leading an organization like Netflix and creating a culture in the business. And he said a lot of people will tell you need to have, like, our business is a family. We run this business like we're a family. It's a community of people. And he said, in all realities, like, most businesses should not be thought of as we're a family. He's like, because you'd never fire your mom, you'd never fire your sister. He's like, it doesn't typically work that way. He said he thinks businesses should be thought of more like a professional sports team, how we're a high performing team. We pay our players well to perform well. And if you have one bad game, you're not done. Obviously, you're sticking around. But in one sense, you also are, your job is always up if someone else is going to perform better than you are. And so you always should be competing for that position, and know that one bad day is not going to throw you off. But this is a sports team. We are trying to win. And that's how he kind of thinks of his organization, as more like a sports team than a family unit. It was just an interesting juxtaposition to a lot of the business I've seen that run themselves as a, hey, we are a family type culture.
Mm-hmm.
It was something I've been thinking about recently that caught my attention.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well, just to add on to that, I think that's kind of an interesting thought, because for some people, I'm sure it's successful, but I think that's like drawing the line in the sand. Like, really what that's saying is like, you're leaving your emotions at the door, but you're bringing your empathy for your team, right? And especially in leadership, I think that like this is my viewpoint. Looking at a leader, somebody leading me, is like, I don't want you to be emotional and unhinged. I want you to look steady, and I want to have confidence in you. And for me, that's leaving my emotion at the door and taking my opinion out of things, but bringing my empathy to be human with you, right? To say like, I hear you, like, let's solve that problem. How do you empathize with your, whether it's your employee or your co-founder? And that's a really important rule, I think, when we talk about like drawing the line in the sand. And I think that translates to spouse relationships or family relationships in business too.
I really like that. Yeah, it's something I don't think people necessarily are always able to articulate as well as you just did, but is knowing that a leader has empathy, but yet they're not always acting off of their emotions, I think is huge. And I think we've all been in a position where we have a leader or a boss or someone that is just very manipulated by their emotions all the time. You're not sure, you can't trust what their decision making is, if it's the right decision actually for the right time. And so
Right.
I really like how you articulated that. What has been the biggest influence for you over the past couple of years, as far as books or podcasts that you've kind of relied on for a lot of direction and guidance as you've been building the businesses you've been building? Has there been a few core foundational things that you've been listening to and reading?
Yeah. I consume a lot of things. It's funny, I've moved away from like audiobooks and more into podcasting, because I think that talking about time management, like at least I don't have time to listen to like a 16-hour book, right? And try to absorb all of it. And so I've really moved like more into podcasting, and a lot of that focus has been on, relationship building or content driven, especially around, like finance or team management. And that it's just like a quick bite, like 45 minutes that you can absorb, you can think, and then we go on to the next topic. And it's like part of that, like, always learn something new every day mentality, and broaden your horizons essentially. And I'm trying to think, admittedly, I haven't really listened to any audiobooks recently.
We're on the same way. Books, I love books, but I feel like a lot of books could be summarized in one chapter versus the 16 that they have. And then that's why I really like summaries and podcasts, like you were saying, versus always reading the entire book or trying to listen to the entire book, because I don't know if that's always the best use of time. So I completely understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just trying, I can't even think of any books that I read, but like I listen to like a lot of Planet Money, and, just those like quick things, and even things outside of business, or, like just general subject matter that I know nothing about. Right. And it's always interesting, like how it intersects with your life. Like, I didn't draw that correlation or like how that affects me. But I like learning. I've always been a learner and I want to learn new things, even if it's not within my lane of focus, in my business or my career, essentially. It's definitely important.
That's always one of the most satisfying things to me, I think, is when I'm doing something completely unrelated to business and I just watch something, it could be anything, and then something just clicks in your mind. Like it makes a connection you did not have before watching something
Right.
completely unrelated. And I forget what it was. I was driving with my wife the other day and like suddenly she could tell like my stare went blank and I was like, what? I was like, I think I just figured something out. Like it just like something just clicks randomly or doing something completely different. And I think a lot of times those creative endeavors or listening to something new or learning something new completely unrelated to your business is so powerful because not only does it get your mind to think in a new way, but I think that really does unlock a lot of things that you get trapped into staring at the same issues and the same problems
Yep.
day after day.
Well, and
Are
that I
you
was going to say, one thing that makes me think of one of the podcasts I listen to, and I always plug it, not that I have any interest in it, but it's called All In. And it's like crazy to me how many people haven't heard about it because it's such a
I
good
don't think I've heard
podcast.
of
But
that.
it's a group of four gentlemen who are very successful venture capitalists, and they talk a lot about tech, and they blend into politics very often. But what's really interesting about this podcast is they all have very different views on things, whether it's politics or VC or tech or whatever it is. They've got a guy who is very much in like the science space, and then there's the political guy, and then there's the tech founder, and like it's I appreciate it because they're bringing multiple viewpoints together to kind of challenge each other's thinking. And it's really powerful, and I oftentimes listen to that and I'm like, wow, I didn't even think about it that way because we're oftentimes so one-sided and only standing in one set of shoes. It's called All In. It's got like David Sachs and Jason Calacanis, and it's a really good podcast. Even if you're not in the tech world, they talk about a multitude of different subjects, whether it's foreign affairs or whatever it is. It's really interesting and it's really broadened my viewpoint on a lot of things.
I really like that. I like like you said, having those different viewpoints in the same room. I think that's something we've somewhat lost today, where I feel like a lot of times if you have opposing viewpoints to someone, it always ends up in some form of an argument. It's not productive at all. That's why I love real debates where you have two different people with opposing views that are just talking. They're not attacking each other, they're just talking, sharing those ideas. And so I really like that it seems like you said they have different personalities and they have a wide ranging discussion. I really think it's one of the reasons Joe Rogan's podcast is so big is because you're a very familiar person in Joe Rogan, but he talks about so many different things from
Right.
science to sports to bringing people on about therapies and all these random things he talks about. And it really gets your mind to think in so many different ways. And that's why I think his podcast is one of the biggest ones, because he has that diverse well of knowledge that he's bringing in there. And so that's really cool. Do you run your businesses through the Traction model? I think I saw David made a note about Traction. Do you use Traction in your businesses?
No, we didn't, but I do know the model. But I didn't directly implement that model, no.
Is there any specific kind of structure model you follow with your businesses, or is this something you've learned over time? Is there a specific cadence you use to keep all your employees on the same page and set goals and do those meetings every single week? Do you have a model you follow for that?
So with our businesses, we didn't do that, but with Energize Colorado, we use the exact Traction model and do the L10. And so we specifically focus like Monday morning meetings. We're meeting with the entire team. We're doing our report outs on our scorecards and rocks, essentially any issues that we have or any announcements. And then I do, and I find this really valuable, and it's only sustainable in a very small team, but every other week I have one-to-ones with every employee of the company to essentially just touch base and have just a space for you and me to say like, what are you dealing with? What's going on? And it can be anything about business, it can be personal, but it's this touch point with each person to just have that, kind of like intimate time in 30 minutes to just discuss whatever's going on. And then we also have our end of week check-ins. So we're starting the week with the team. We have touch points throughout the week, of course, and then we end the week with the team too, to say like, what were your wins? Like, what fires did you put out today? What are you doing for the weekend? Like kind of humanizing the whole corporate, culture, if you will, sometimes,
Yeah.
which we really lose touch with people sometimes. And I think culturally, that's something that was implemented in the organization before I was there. And I think culturally, it's created a very tight-knit team that like consistently has your hand, my hand's always on your back, basically, right? Like I'm always here for you. I'm always listening to you. And I think that traction system allows us to stop talking and listen to other teammates, right? And that's a big flaw at like I've had in leadership and probably absolutely still have, right? Like we feel, especially as owners or executives, that like we have to constantly fill the empty space in the room all the time by talking. And I think if we would just stop talking and we would listen, there's a lot more value in that, right? And leaving room for like all the voices at the table is really important to me, right? Like every team member, whether you're, boots on the ground employee or whether you're an executive of the company, like your voice needs to be heard, right? Because there's so many things to be learned from that. And that's what I really like about, the traction system within our organization today.
That's really cool to hear that. Traction is not something we did in our past business, but it's something I've been learning a lot about. My friend that I was talking about that lives in Colorado that has that business out there, he implemented Traction in his business about 4 or 5 years ago now, and it was kind of life-changing for their business. Then I had another friend out here that implemented his business, and his business completely turned around for the better as well. And so I've been really doing studying on that, seeing how that whole system works. And like you said, I really like that it's not meetings all the time, but there are consistent touch points. And I really like about it that it seems that everyone's responsible for a number, everyone has a goal, and it keeps everyone accountable the same way, whether you're a leader or whether you're at the bottom rung of the organization, in a sense, to having something you're accountable for that you're going to be talking about in front of a group at least once a week. And so I really, really like that accountability system. But going to what you said about you enjoy hearing from everyone in the organization because they all bring such different viewpoints, I think that's so powerful. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. One thing we often talked about, we used to do in-person events for our customers. We'd bring all of our customers out, and we had Amazon sellers, and most of our Amazon sellers sold books on Amazon. So there's a bunch of nerdy booksellers in a room talking about selling on Amazon. And It was a blast. But one of the things that we found over the years doing these events that was so funny, but seemed to be a very reoccurring theme, is that it was often a brand new person, a very small seller that was doing something completely out of the normal for what we normally do, that to them didn't mean very much. But if you applied that to a 7 or 8 figure Amazon seller, that one little thing they're implementing in their business could completely transform this other business. And we really came to the assumption that everyone has these different skill sets and unique abilities. And whether they're just starting out or they've been doing it for a long time, there's something they're bringing of value. There's something their voice is sharing, even with everyone, even if they're just brand new, sharing what they're doing, sharing their experiences can help the entire organization or help everyone at the meeting as a whole. And so I really like that the traction model and the way you guys are doing it seems to be able to bring in that aspect of it where everyone's able to have somewhat of an opinion, to voice their concerns, to talk about what's happening in the organization. And I'm sure that leads to just a more cohesive organization as a whole.
Well, and it also lends insight to how everybody plays on the team, essentially, right? Because in my opinion, that's one of the big things that leaders miss is like, you get siloed sometimes. Like your employees get siloed in their work and they're not talking to each other, or maybe they don't understand what the other person is doing, right? And so systems like these allow you to say like, oh, like I know what Matt's doing and I know what you're doing. And like, how can I help support you? And what is the effect of your work? How does that trickle down into my work, right? And it doesn't just like humanize the process, it lends clarity to like your organizational systems and how people play with each other essentially in the organization.
Have you implemented any type of weekly catch up or get together meeting with your spouse for planning and things like that? Do you guys have like any type of weekly huddles or routines that you go through with your husband that you found to be helpful?
Yeah, we try. Not always successful at this, but once a week we try to get out of the house, have grandma watch the baby. Well, she's a toddler now, but watch Eva. And we just try to get, 2 or 3 hours, whether we go to dinner or do something, just to remove all the distractions of life, right? And really like hyper focus on each other to say like, how are you doing? Like we talked about this thing that blew up at work, but like, how's that affecting you? Like, how do you feel? Like, how's your mental health? How's your headspace right now? It also, I think, just gives us an ability to reconnect with each other, whether we're having dinner or like, rock climbing or riding bikes or mountain biking, like it just allows you to get grounded again with your spouse. And we're not always successful at it every week, but we really try to find that time.
Yeah, that's something that I want to get a lot better at. There's something I'm not great at now, but I think it's important to make even though you, like you said, throughout the week, I'm sure you spend time with your spouse and you see them and you talk and all those things, but setting out a very specific time as a time to review the week, to plan what's going on next week, is not something I've done well, but I really want to start getting better at with my wife. Is just setting a time once a week, once probably the kids are in bed, because once you start having a lot of kids, it's even harder to give them to grandma because then they just multiply. We have baby number 4 arriving in like 8 weeks.
Oh
and so
gosh.
we've got a house full. But after the kids are asleep, is setting a time or something like that, or maybe once every other week or once every 3 weeks, drop them off at grandma or something like that for those reviews, I think would be really, really helpful. It's something I've been thinking about. David is very good at that. Him and his fiance do weekly huddles right now, and they have a whole structure to it, and they've been very consistent at that. And he said it's been one of the most transformational things for their relationship is having that time each week to talk through and say, hey, what were the good things? And hey, what was the bad things? Where did we miss the mark? Where can we improve for this following week? And a lot of times I think those things kind of get thrown under the rug if you don't have that consistent time every week. So that's pretty cool that you guys are able to do that. Completely changing topics for 1 second. I want to go back to something you said at the very beginning because I'm curious your thoughts on it. You said something along the lines of just putting your phone away, being present for your family. That's something that recently I've realized, partly because I've realized and partly because people have told me. I have my phone around me all the time, and it's so easy to just be with your kids or be with your spouse, but still have that distraction in your hand, have something there. And putting that phone away, even in a separate room, has helped so much with that dynamic. How have you thought about technology in relationship to your spouse and your child and your use of it? Do you allow your child to be on tablets? Have you thought about that very much? About our businesses are run on technology, so it's easy for us to always have them in our hands, but it's also not always the most beneficial thing. How do you kind of manage that dynamic in your house right now? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's like the topic of conversation right now for sure. And it's just kind of a constant power struggle, I think. Like I live in the world where like I grew up and like I didn't have a cell phone until I was like a freshman in college. And that was not a thing for me. And like we had like the Hewlett Packard, like desktop and like we didn't have this connectivity to everything. And like I grew up outside in the dirt, like I was in the mountains and like I had dirt under my fingernails and like that was, and I loved that. Like I loved being out there and doing something that was interactive to me. And I think the risk that we're running today is like, one, it's really hard to get away from screen time, right? It's everywhere, TVs, tablets, phones. And I didn't want that for our kids. You know, I wanted them to avoid it as much as we possibly could, right? Because not only of my experience as being a child, but then my experience as an adult, like if you go look at your usage report and your time spent on applications, it's
makes you sick.
Horrifying, right? Like you're like, oh my God, I spent X amount of numbers on, Instagram. I hate that,
Yeah.
And so one thing like we've implemented is like, I'm saying this now with a 2-year-old, right? Like this could definitely change, but I don't want her to be pulled into that stuff. I think it's super addictive. I think especially as adults, we experience the addiction to that kind of thing. How do we engage her in things that really like grow her brain, right? And like let's get outdoors, let's learn to ride a bike. And and I'm not judging the situation with families, like every family is different, but like I don't want my kid to be plugged into a tablet at dinner. That's really important for family structure, is to like have important conversation at dinner and connect. Again, it's like that people aspect, like connecting and listening to your people, whether that's your children or your employees, right? I think, and my husband and I had this conversation, like, and we haven't implemented this yet, but it's also really hard to get away from your phone because your calculator's on there, your camera's on there, their flashlights on there. And like, how do we go back to this analog system? Like, do I have to carry a flashlight around? Like, do I need access to that?
Yeah, flashlight button.
Totally. Like, do I put a calculator in my front pocket in case I need to, like, do I take out my camera, with my like card? Like, I don't know. I don't know really how to solve that, but we've become so dependent on this. And that's something we're trying to be very mindful of, and we're not always perfect at it, but we're trying to be mindful of it.
Yeah, it's a very difficult balance. I'm in the same shoes of you, but I love to just try and set my phone in my room and not have it on me. But I always need something. It's a calculator or the flashlight or some random thing on my phone where you always need something, or you get a stupid 2-factor authentication code on the computer and you go grab your phone out of the bedroom to grab that off. Our children, when I didn't have kids, I always said our kids would never have tablets. They wouldn't be in front of the screens all the time and stuff like that. And then you realize why parents do that so often is because it's so easy to give your child a tablet and suddenly they're quiet in a spot, sitting the same thing. You can get things done. You can go about your day. And one thing we found with our kids, when we take that tablet away, they have no idea what to do with their time. There's always on you. They're always with you. And so that's why it's so easy to just give a tablet. It settles them down and stuff like that. But it's not always the best solution. And so we've recently instituted where there's a certain time of the day they can have their tablets. And then when it's not, we stick them on top of the refrigerator where they can't grab those tablets. And they have to do it. And maybe this sounds cruel. I don't know if this sounds cruel, but I remember growing up, I played outside a lot. Like just going outside and playing was what me and my siblings did all the time.
Right.
And my kids don't do that near as much.
Right.
And so there's a certain time of the day now where we're like, hey, go outside. I'm going to lock the back door. Just figure it out. It's like, we're not going to entertain you. You have to figure out how to entertain yourselves for a little while.
Right.
And they always want dad or mom to come out and play with them or entertain them. It's like, hey, this is part of growing up is just, hey, learning how to make a game, learning how to play together, learning how to entertain yourself. You're outside for the next hour, figure it out. You have playgrounds, your toys, all that kind of stuff. And so it's definitely a difficult balance, especially as the kids get older. Like thinking about my son, he's already at the point now, he's still young, but thinking about the stuff I've told him about business and how we can make money and maybe start this business and things like that. And you want to, in one sense, give them the technology to help them with that. But on the other hand, you also want them to be a kid and not have a computer in their room at all times and worry about these things. I don't know. It's a hard balance. I think it's something people are going to be struggling over for the next decade, especially as AI expands and gets even more prevalent in our lives.
Yeah.
I don't know the good answer for it, but it's a very difficult challenge right now that we're trying to work through. It's just curious, what you guys are doing. So it's interesting to see you guys.
Well, you're much further in it than I am. And so it's helpful to hear that. But, one thing that really, I kind of had the aha moment with screen time was I was watching this, I don't know if it was on like TikTok or what it was, but this dad essentially, videotaped his children, and the engagement was when he was off his phone and when he was on his phone. And he has a daughter about my age, or about Eva's age, excuse me. And so like the first clip is when he's not on his phone and his little toddler walks in the room and she like is engaging with her dad and she's smiling and she's playing and like is deeply, deeply engaged because he is giving his time to her. Right. And then the next clip is him on his phone. And so she walks in and sees dad and she's kind of like, sussing the situation out and trying to get his attention. And just, it was really sad to me to watch that. And I think about like as parents, how often we're absorbed in that and our children are looking for our attention. And then like, to your point, they're vying for our attention all the time is because we're not, being diligent and mindful of that with them. And it just broke my heart. And you see it all the time, like friends hang out, like, and they're just on their phones and they're sitting next to each other. And I'm like, what kind of quality time is that? And it's a big problem. And again, we have to be so mindful of it.
That really hits home because I know I do that all the time. And I also know that I tend to tell myself, I spend way more time with my kids than I think most parents do. But spending time with your kids being in the same room is not the same as being present and being with them. And just because I'm with my kids for 4 hours, if I'm scrolling through my phone for 3.5 of that, not directly paying attention to them, it's not the same. They understand, even if they can't express that that's not quality time with dad, sitting next to someone on the phone when they occasionally answer questions. And so that's something I really want to figure out a better strategy for going forward. But yeah, it's definitely something that's important. And I think something good to struggle with as the kids grow older and things like that. So where could people, as we kind of wind this down, where could people, if they want to learn more about you or follow you or things like that, what's the best place for them to get in contact with you or just get updates on what you're up to?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So that's always a good place to go. You can also visit our website at energizecolorado.com to kind of get an update on what we're doing and companies we're funding and a lot of subject matter in there. So those are always really good places. I'm not nearly as active on social media as I used to be, but like LinkedIn's kind of the one social media platform that I'm pretty active in.
And if people are interested in learning more about Energize Colorado or maybe even getting funding for a business, do you only work with businesses in Colorado or do you work with businesses outside of Colorado as well?
Nope. We're solely focused on businesses in Colorado. So there's no county designation. It's literally any business within the state of Colorado, any county. And we focus on funding all entrepreneurs, but we have a designation for businesses that are rural, veteran, BIPOC, and women-owned, because we know that those are deeply underserved communities when it comes to capital access. And so while we fund all people, we have a certain skill set, especially around those demographics of borrowers.
And then if someone's listening to this, let's say they're in Colorado, or let's say even they're out of Colorado and they're wanting to get funding for a business with a business like yours or yours specifically, what type of things would you recommend they think through and have in place before really approaching someone like yourself for funding for their small business? There are a few things they should always consider or have in place before kind of going down that route.
Yeah, a plan, right? Like we talk to so many entrepreneurs that are like, well, I've got this idea. And I'm like, I love that. I love the ideation. I love the proof of concept, but a lot of access to capital needs, product and market needs a plan, needs a business plan, needs projections. Even if they're wrong, bring us something so we can digest it at least, right? I think also in Colorado, and this is something that all of us in this industry are guilty of, is that it's not as easy as you would think to navigate the resources for small businesses, right? And so what's really beautiful about this state, though, is that you can reach out to several people in the ecosystem of small business and entrepreneurism, and they're willing to talk to you they're willing to give their time to help you kind of navigate that. And so I think it's always worth reaching out to say, like, here's what I want to do. Here's my idea. Maybe I have some traction. Maybe my, business is 5 years old. Like, who can I talk to? And I think we're always willing to give that time to help you navigate it, because there's not like this one-stop shop right now where you can like get technical assistance or resources or, whether it's workforce or employees, whatever it may be. So yeah, but have a plan. Like, I think in the vein of like, don't waste people's time, like have something, for us to work with and digest, at least to better help direct you.
Gotcha. Okay. So Energize Colorado, have a plan, have something more than just an idea when you approach someone or Energize Colorado, or probably I'm assuming it's for a lot of businesses like yours in the country is, hey, have some type of proof of concept, show the idea has some more thought behind it besides just an idea in your mind, put some numbers on paper. And I'm just curious, what funding levels do you guys offer? Is it like very small business startup, like a couple $1,000 type thing? Or is it up to large ideas that need significant funding? What range do you guys fund in?
Yeah, this is a pretty important delineation in like the capital stack, if you will. So we right now are for established businesses. So you have to have at least 2 months of revenue to be funded. And I would very much call us a microfinancer. We go up to $150,000, but there are a lot of players that can help with more institutionalized businesses. You might be a manufacturer in Colorado or, run a childcare facility, and you need more robust capital to help with, real estate or whatever it may be. We're really focused on that $150,000 range to $10,000 for operational capital. So those day-to-day expenses, hiring employees, supplies, buying equipment maybe. But that's really important because a lot of the big gap in the market, I think right now, is that we don't have a lot of startup financing. So somebody's like, oh, I want to, start a business and I have a proof of concept, but I'm not to market yet. That's a really hard area to fund right now. And we see a lot of people going to friends and family to do that. And debt typically is not a good tool for that type of business. Not always, but is not a good, type of capital tool. So just a couple things to earmark there as people are looking.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. We'll link to your LinkedIn in the show notes of this podcast in case people want to connect with you or just follow along. And then it's Energize Colorado. Is it energizecolorado.org, .com?
.com.
.com, right? energizecolorado.com if you want to find more about business lending if you're in Colorado. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.